welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. I'm Mark Glazer, Executive Editor of PBS Media Shift. This week we'll be talking about Pinterest, the visual social network that is now monetizing, putting up promoted pins, also a self-service advertising, and also referring lots of traffic to magazine sites and others. In fact, referring more traffic than Twitter, Reddit, and many other social networks other than Facebook. We'll talk about the evolution of Pinterest and what it means for big publishers. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor, NextSpace and NextKids Potrero Hill in San Francisco, where they offer co-working space and adjacent daycare for infants and toddlers. Learn more about their pioneering program at bit.ly/NextSpacePH. You can learn more about NextSpace co-working spaces around the country at nextspace.us. And indeed, I am at NextSpace working right now, and my son is actually next door. It's his first birthday, so it's a fun day here at NextSpace. There will be a lot of cupcakes, put it that way. So before we get started on our podcast, I want to introduce our panel. We have Andrew Lee from American University, Christine Haney from the New York Times, Bob Gilbreth from Ahology, Fanny Cohen, our producer, and Kate Lewis from Hearst Magazines. Christine, you've been writing about Pinterest. You had a story recently in the Times about it. How has it evolved over the years? It always had this kind of visual look to it. Now it seems like it's got a massive audience, very highly, 70 to 80% women, 92% of the pins coming from women. It's built a huge audience, but it seems like now is the time that it's monetizing. Now is the time that it's starting to partner with media companies. I mean, how have you seen it change, especially this year?
It's so much bigger with magazines now, particularly women's magazines, and I'm seeing a lot of partnerships in terms of advertisers for women's magazines want help from the magazines and kind of promoting their content on Pinterest. I think people are also discovering Pinterest in a different way from Twitter because Pinterest is so positive, and that's something that kind of sponsors, advertisers want to be associated with. So it's just grown tremendously, especially recently, and because advertisers want to be aligned with it, and women's magazines really need to get more traffic in now that newsstand sales are declining. So magazines have really kind of attached themselves to it and are finding that more of their traffic is coming from Pinterest now than even other social media things like Twitter and in some cases Facebook.
And so really it seems like more of the kind of big publishers and legacy publishers are starting to pay attention to it more than ever. Is that what you're seeing?
They really have to pay attention to it, yes, and it's a huge kind of indicator for them, especially as newsstand sales are struggling.
And on that note, Kate, at Hearst, how have things changed? I mean, it seems like Pinterest now is doing more outreach to magazines. They have people who are really trying to partner with magazines. I mean, how is it for Hearst? I mean, how has your relationship changed with Pinterest? I mean, is it something you're paying more attention to, putting a lot of time and effort into it?
Definitely. I mean, the preponderance of our sites are for women, so we like the fact that there is a lot of active women, doing craft projects and talking about makeup and sharing fashion inspiration and things like that on Pinterest. It's huge for us. And also, historically magazines have such strong visuals, and unlike Twitter, this is an opportunity to really show the kind of photography that our brands specifically are known for. I think a lot of the time people mistake Pinterest as a place for bloggers who are crafting, and we definitely use it for that because we love those people and we love sourcing them to contribute to our sites, but really it's a place where beautiful images happen, and there's Elle Decor is such an important player, and those kinds of things. I know when people are renovating their homes, they're creating boards, so it's a really active part of it.
And Fanny was just bringing up a story from Digiday about kind of the amount of traffic that's being referred from Pinterest to Hearst publications. I mean, is it it's basically second to Facebook. I mean, how is that? Has that grown even recently this year?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I know on most of our sites now from the social media space, it's second to Facebook. Absolutely. So it's, Google, Facebook, and Pinterest are sort of the top three. Twitter is still incredibly important to us, but in some ways it's as much about being a branding tool in the way Instagram is, but Pinterest can really drive traffic, and it drives traffic for a different kind of story. What you get from Twitter is like what's happening this minute, that sort of urgency, but Pinterest allows us to showcase kind of evergreen long lead stuff. It's amazing at the holidays right now is we're hot and heavy with Halloween, and it's like every story that's up on Pinterest now is about the year of painting your pumpkin.
Yeah, and what about the traffic that's coming in from Pinterest? I know there's been a lot of talk about social media referred traffic and how they're not loyal, they stay for half a second, they look at something and it's a drive-by. Is that similar with Pinterest, or do you see a little bit more engagement coming from Pinterest?
Anecdotally speaking, I think we do see more traffic coming from Pinterest that sticks, just because it is more of a lean-backy type experience, Pinterest, because you're really there because you want to feel inspired and you're waiting for something to strike you. And so I think that when you do get struck, you're more invested than you might be on some of the other social feeds. Although, I mean, obviously, like you can, sticky traffic comes everywhere, but I do think that the mindset behind Pinterest is of someone who's like, I'm digging in, I'm looking for something juicy to kind of feast my eyes on, or some recipe I'm going to make, or some, project I'm going to take on, or some beauty tip I'm going to try.
Yeah. And Bob, tell us a little bit about Ahology, your company. You are helping brands kind of become a little bit more prevalent on Pinterest. I mean, how do you help them out exactly?
Yeah, well, we've been working on Pinterest with large companies like Procter & Gamble and Kraft for 2 years now. And the reason we got in is we saw high potential, but at the same time we saw that Pinterest is a lot different than what major brands have been doing in social media today. Most of the companies we work with have tried some things on Pinterest and do a pin a day or maybe a pin a week of something that they put on Twitter or Facebook, and that kind of falls flat. So we've been helping them kind of understand that, honestly, Pinterest is, I'd put it more in the search bucket than the social bucket, if anything. And search is about content discovery, it's about projects, it's about planning, and that's really kind of the core of what Pinterest is. So a lot of what we're doing is helping companies source the right content that the Pinterest audience is looking for, like search, do optimization and multiple pins a day to understand what's working and what's not. And then from there, you can figure out increasingly with promoted pins what type of content is resonating, and then choose to promote that content that already is working.
And you talked about search and how important search is, and now Pinterest is kind of updated with this guided search where they're literally breaking down the keyword of everything that you put in there, and then also suggesting kind of sections as you search. I mean, how has that changed things for discoverability?
Yeah, it's making the game, again, much more about the quality of the content itself and each specific pin that you're placing, rather than things like a follower model. Again, that's kind of been the historic social world, is you try to get a bunch of followers and hope that they see you. Now, and that's originally how Pinterest began, as a follower-based model for content discovery. But honestly, following is it's not the perfect way to discover content. And Pinterest Drive is to see what you're interested in, not based on who you follow, but based on the content that you're pinning, that you're clicking through, and even the content increasingly that you're engaging with when you're off of Pinterest. So the idea is, how can we just read your mind almost to get you the best content that you're looking for right now?
And you also work with content, basically for the brands. You work with bloggers in order to you've built kind of a content network too, haven't you?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges for marketers. I mean, content marketing has always been a challenge, because it's really not the business, and in terms of content like articles and images that are Pinterest friendly, that's not what brands historically have done. So sometimes they're in this content marketing conundrum where they don't know where to start, they don't know how much to spend. And so our way of getting them quickly on Pinterest is to provide a license to some of the greatest performing content by smaller publishers and medium-sized publishers who use our technology to grow their presence and their traffic, but in return allow the companies that we work with to send them even more traffic by using their content from Pinterest.
Yeah. And Andrew, I'm curious about your take about how kind of the importance of Pinterest for publishers. You know, it seems like a lot of other social networks that really just didn't monetize itself for the longest time, and now that it's grown to 64 million uniques, I think a month was the latest number I saw. That's a big audience. What is the potential for Pinterest kind of as a company and also in working with publishers?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Bob said is really interesting. I think we need to change our thinking about Pinterest. We tend to lump all social media together into the same bucket, right, in terms of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Those are all dealing with feeds, but if we think about what we do with Pinterest, it's actually a lot more like Wikipedia, or what Bob said is search, right? It's actually well-curated content that's sitting there for the taking, whereas the common lament of things like Twitter and Instagram is that if you happen to be looking at the feed at the time, you can enjoy those things, but very quickly, if you're not in front of that feed, it's very hard to dig back and to find the stuff that's there. So in that sense, Twitter is much more like 1950s television, right? If you're not watching it live, it kind of gets hurtled into some weird part of cyberspace, and we all know Twitter's search is not that great, and it's probably just lost unless someone happened to retweet it and to favorite it, and you find it later on through some crazy method. But Pinterest boards are persistent. People keep updating them, they evolve, they get better, and it's really quite hard to find content on the internet that's user-generated that has that dynamic of people caring enough to keep it curated and up-to-date going forward. So as I mentioned, you know, Wikipedia does this well. Folks like Vox and other folks trying to do persistent content are trying the same thing, but so far I think Pinterest is the best example of this, but it is kind of the sleeper social network because most people don't really pay attention to it. And at the recent Online News Association conference that both Mark and I were at, it was hard to even find anyone talking about Pinterest. People were actually talking about some more dubious social networks for news like Snapchat and 6-second videos, but I think Pinterest is something that they need to take a bigger look at. And you do see folks like Guardian and other folks putting very extensive photo essays there on Pinterest to drive eyeballs. And the way that you can scan Pinterest without having to know any particular language is great, right? You can't really experience Twitter unless you're a speaker of that language, but the visual language of Pinterest really allows anyone to jump right in and get familiar with it and start using it.
Yeah, and you can even look at what's changing on Twitter itself, trying to become more visual, so you can tell that people are actually trying to become more like Pinterest in a way. Christine, I'm curious, what's your take on which publications have done well using Pinterest? I mean, I know BuzzFeed has worked really closely with Pinterest. Are there certain publications that really kind of do better than others?
I'm finding that Bon Appetit has done well. There's a lot of kind of young people coming to Bon Appetit, and what seems to work well are pictures of food. I mean, who doesn't want to look at photographs of food all day? So that's one area that's done well. Fashion has done well. I think they had a big, they did really well during Fashion Week. So that's an area. And craft magazines. I mean, Pinterest has a great audience of women from the Midwest who are really into crafting. And so if you're getting like a kind of Better Homes and Gardens, Martha Stewart has done hugely on Pinterest, and she's been huge on Pinterest for a couple of years now. I was writing about her, many Thanksgivings ago about her Pinterest following. So they all seem to have the most potential. The question is, and this actually came from the Ahology report, is that they can't risk losing their customers. The magazines can't risk losing their customers to Pinterest because Pinterest consumers are spending more time there than watching TV and even looking at their magazines. But really, the magazines that are doing well seem to be food, fashion, and anything craft related, and some design. I mean, I'm following, baby nurseries kind of, on Pinterest. So.
Right. And Kate, that does seem like a challenge for Hearst in that, the users of Pinterest are spending less time reading magazines, spending less time on TV. I mean, how do you kind of change the equation? Because Pinterest is a little bit of a time suck. Once you're in there, it's really hard to get out. So, and people want to go right back into it. So how do you deal with that challenge?
We were just actually talking about this today. I take a very democratic view of content online. I think people will read the same thing a million different places online, and I think they even do it in print. I find myself looking at pictures that I saw a week ago on a website in my Us Weekly every week. I think that's just sort of consumer behavior now. There's this sense, it's like that fear of missing out thing. Like, if there's one tiny detail about George and Amal's wedding that I missed, like maybe I'll find it here. So it concerns me. I think exposure for your content is really what you want, and you have to trust that the audience will figure out and engage with you because you produce that kind of content. And I actually think Pinterest is an amazing place to showcase that, because, as I said, I think it's a reader who's really invested, and if they find something they want, they're going to stick with it. So it worries me not at all.
Yeah. And what about, is there a potential for Pinterest to actually drive more print subscriptions? Is there a way to use it that way?
I think so. I think, driving traffic is driving brand awareness, is driving them to a subscribe button. So I think there's a chain there that can certainly end in a subscription, and that doesn't necessarily end in, I think it ends in buy-in overall, like whether that influences newsstand behavior, like maybe they're at the airport, they need to buy a magazine before they get on their flight, and they were familiar with us from Pinterest. So it could affect everything. I don't think we know tangibly how much it does, but we certainly know that traffic to our website and exposure to our brand is the healthy way to go in terms of supporting print digitally.
And Bob, in looking at what Fanny was bringing up with George Clooney's wedding, it is just overload when you look at something. I was looking at kind of Halloween costumes and stuff today, and you could look at a million pins on a lot of these subjects. How do you stand out? How do you kind of recommend to people to do a good pin that can be seen above the noise?
Yeah, it's really about understanding and frankly going with that glimpse mentality. It's frankly, again, similar to almost leafing through a magazine. It's the picture that first hooks people, and then they look at the copy before deciding whether to repin or to click through to the website. And so a lot of what we do with our technology and some human skill as well, doing things like image cropping, sometimes layering quick descriptions on top of an image, because people don't always read the copy. They're literally just kind of letting their unconscious brain, and you have to do this with mobile because it's 75% mobile, which is even smaller and more of a winner-take-all type mentality. But people are looking for the picture to almost unconsciously trigger an idea or something they're planning or something they have a need state on. And then with a really good image followed by a great description, then you can hook them into that repin or click through to the site. But it's a lot of data. It's a lot of, again, going back to the future of some of that SEO type activity where understanding what people's needs are, looking very closely of your analytics reports on what's attracting people. We do a lot of content calendar work. And what's also really interesting about Pinterest is because people are in that planning state, different types of topics pop at different times. For example, you mentioned Halloween and painting pumpkins, someone did. Did you know Halloween actually was starting to peak on Pinterest in mid-August?
Yeah. We had our our Halloween planning session for our family-oriented brands in July. Like, in some ways, that pace now is really dictating how we start to plan.
Yeah, and that's that idea that you're seeing people, that mom who wants to make a great occasion for her kids starts pinning to her Halloween board a couple months in advance, but then might not click through to the specific ideas until the week before Halloween, that's a different type of media mentality.
Yeah, and Kate, when you're planning these things, how much now is around the promoted pins? How much do you feel like you need to put money into Pinterest to get noticed versus what you can do organically?
I think we don't actually feel like we need to put money into Pinterest that much. It's not a part of our strategy. Partly that's because I'm purely on the editorial side, so the audience team may have a slightly different take. But the truth is that, the wonderful thing about Pinterest is that these stories that you posted back in July, because that's when you did your Halloween cake story, they'll start to emerge again in August and September and October and really rev up, and you don't need to do anything. just because people are they're deliberately hunting for you.
Yeah, Christine, what do you think about that as far as publishers? I mean, do you think they're going to have to start putting more? I know at Facebook they started just so innocently with, you know, promoted posts and all that, and then all of a sudden, well, if you weren't doing promoted posts, your page is just disappearing in the feed. I mean, is the same kind of dynamic possible with Pinterest?
I think Pinterest is going to have to be more aggressive with magazines and kind of thinking of ways to make money with magazines. So on that side, there is definitely going to be more of a push. In ways, when I spoke with Pinterest, they haven't really ventured a lot into the area of making money off of magazines. And what they said is that they really just value the content of magazines. So they haven't really been that aggressive.
What do you think, Andrew? I mean, do you think this is something where, you know, Pinterest now, if they're going towards an IPO or a buyout or something in their business model, you know, are they going to get more aggressive, and, you know, are publishers and others going to pay the price?
Yeah, I think they're going to have to get more aggressive, but I think they're in a great position. It's really hard to see anyone else doing what they're doing. As you mentioned, you know, it's strange that for the public, I think Pinterest, in terms of how many actual users of it, is not a huge amount, but there's so many folks mimicking its design, its organization, its ability to present spatial information so fast and so efficiently that I think it's definitely going to be an attractive offering for folks long term.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think about the Selfserve? I know now they have a way where pretty much anybody can promote a pin. Does that give them potential as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's lots of kind of micro ways to engage the stuff and for people to pay to promote certain parts. I mean, images are particularly tough, right? So that's something where the technology they're going to have to generate to work with images is going to have to really be developed, right? It's one thing to filter on text, to key on text to promote things, to key on text to bring up an ad. But with images, we're still very primitive in terms of the algorithms we have to identify what's in an image and what's related between two images. So it's going to depend a lot more on manual manipulation and manual flagging of stuff for people to promote it and to highlight things. And that's exciting, but at the same time really challenging, because we really have a lot more to go in terms of good AI or algorithms to deal with images like that.
Yeah, Bob, do you notice that too in working with kind of Pinterest, just the images and trying to do, I guess, SEO for images? That's not something that a lot of people, a lot of marketers have, you know, knowledge of, or something they're really good at doing.
Yeah, I mean, image is definitely important, but, you know, it's not something that it's, like I say, it's not pure image. It's kind of saying, would you do, again, if you go back to the magazine analogy, we keep going around, you know, there's only so, it's a great picture, right? So it's several things working together. There's not going to be the one perfect picture. Sometimes I laugh at companies will try to do studies and say, we did a study that said red-colored pens do better than blue-colored pens. Well, what do you do if you have blue jeans you have to sell? I mean, that kind of thing we don't need in the industry, and that keeps companies and individuals from making a try. We've seen things like some of the most unprofessional-looking recipe photos do really well. And that's because for some Pinterest users, the perfectly beautiful picture of a recipe doesn't look, you know, it looks unattainable. It looks like something they can't make themselves. So we're still really early in kind of understanding, you know, how people react to different images. But I think the big lesson is you got to get out there and start playing around for yourself if you want to win.
Yeah. And Kate, I'm curious, what on the editorial side, what kind of things have you found on Pinterest that you didn't expect?
I mean, it is an amazing place for us to source ideas. We definitely, I mean, Halloween's a great example, but we're constantly looking for inspiration for the kind of crafts that our readers might like. I mean, it's almost like market research. So we use Pinterest for that, to see what our audiences are talking about, what they're interested in, and then we, you know, use it to find great ideas, and often reach out to people that are smaller bloggers on that site to see if there's stuff we can do with them.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I appreciate the commentary. We'll definitely follow and see how Pinterest does in the coming years. So I want to thank our panel, Andrew Lee from American University, Christine Haney from New York Times.
Thank you.
Bob Gilbreth with Ahology, Fanny
Thanks.
Cohen, our producer, Kate Lewis from Hearst.
Thank
We
you.
want to thank our sponsor, NextSpace, Potrero Hill, Next Kids. You can learn more about their program at bit.ly/NextSpacePH. And we want to thank PBS and the Knight Foundation for making this possible. And we'll catch you each and every week on the Mediatwits every Friday. Take care, everyone.